Thank you so much, Kat and Allison. I'm Laurel, and I'm the virtual programming coordinator of the summit this year, as well as the moderator for this conversation. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm based in Los Angeles on Tongva land. I'm wearing a floral top, and I have some plants behind me. I'm here with the wonderful filmmakers of Manzanar Diverted and Expedition Reclamation, which features stories that are traditionally left out in media. I was able to learn about both films through the Asian Documentary Network, and I'm so excited for all of them to share their knowledge and experience. I'm going to let each of the panelists introduce themselves, and I'll start with Sanjana, who is the co-director of Expedition Reclamation.
My name is Sanjana. I use she, her pronouns. I'm one of the co-directors of Expedition Reclamation. I'm currently in Los Angeles on Tongva land. I have long black curly hair and I have brown skin and brown eyes. Is that a good representation? Okay, cool.
Hi, my name is Anne Kaneko. I'm the director producer of Manzanar Diverted, When Water Becomes Dust. I use she, her pronouns. I'm tuning in from Tongva Chumash Kich lands, also known as Los Angeles. I have a white Mexican blouse with hand embroidery with some birds on it, lots of red and pinks and greens on right now.
Hi, my name is Jin Yoo-Kim. I'm the producer and impact producer of Manzanar Diverted, When Water Becomes Dust. I'm a Korean American woman with highlighted hair, and I'm wearing a purple flower dress, and I'm sitting in front of some plants, and I'm calling in from the land of Tongva Chumash Kich. And is that it? Thank you.
Awesome. Well, I'd love to hear a little bit about how you found your story and how you developed it.
Sanjana, yeah.
Sure. So Expedition Reclamation, for context, is a story of 12 Black, Indigenous, and women of color reclaiming belonging in outdoor recreation. So it's really a tapestry of 12 voices intended to be a conversation starter that represents this movement to reclaim space, because people of color have always lived in reciprocity with nature. But when we look at the way that the outdoor industry is here in America, it's very white. It looks very different. And so this film kind of examines, how do we name the wound, name colonialism, and say what has happened and why the outdoors here looks the way it does? Why is it that BIPOC folks have been pushed out of these spaces? And then how can we then use joy and confidence to reclaim that space and to heal those wounds? And so the way that the story came to be is I am really big into outdoor recreation and I'm just kind of plugged into a lot of those communities. And two of my collaborators are up in rural Washington, and they also are big outdoor wanderers, storytellers in their own ways. And the two of them actually dreamt up this project about, why don't we see this representation of people of color and especially women of color in outdoor recreation. So Chelsea Murphy, who runs the platform She Colors Nature, she and Erin Joy Nash, who's a filmmaker, dreamt up the project. And then I happened to just see a call out on Instagram because they wanted to work really collaboratively. And I was doing my own work in New York and in Park City, Utah, and then in LA, and didn't know them, but then happened to see this call out on Chelsea's page, and it was just me emailing them a million times and us putting this call out for any women who identified as outdoorsy or people that enjoyed outdoor recreation to come get in contact with us. And we had 55 responses. And from those 55, we chose 12 women who were based in Washington. We were filming at the time of COVID, and so we were trying to be as safe as possible, just driving between places and things like that. And with those 12, we wove this tapestry, and with everybody else that responded, we built a community. And so what was really cool about the film and what continues to be really powerful about it is getting to really hear a diversity of how women of color experience the outdoors, since BIPOC is not a monolith. And so finding the stories, to go back to your question, was really just an exploration in community. It was really just us reaching out and saying, hey, who identifies with this? And so many women said, I'm over here in such and such mountain town feeling like I'm the only one. And we got that response from people across the country. So from there, it was really, I think, a process of validation and a process of kind of stepping into this newfound sense of community to put these stories together. Yeah. What about you all with Manzanar?
So, it's funny because I feel like my relationship to Payahunadu really started when I used to take these trips up to Mammoth with a dear friend of mine. She's Iranian American, and we'd go hiking up in Mammoth in the Eastern Sierras. But I think really it's, my parents, my grandparents were all incarcerated during World War II. And so the story of Manzanar, although they weren't incarcerated at Manzanar, that story of forced removal during World War II is definitely part of my own personal history. And I'd been asked to sort of look at Manzanar in kind of a different way, and then I also remembered as I was doing research that this was also the place where Los Angeles gets its water from, right? And that's very profound, especially since my mother has always been very ecologically conscious, environmentally conscious. And so during the drought years, she'd always make us save water. When she was retired and their last car, she wanted to get a Prius, but my father is like, no, we want to get an SUV. So, but that's the kind of mentality that she had. And so so when I was doing research around Manzanar, I realized this was such a great place to look at because it was a convergence of all these stories. This is a very intersectional story of how people have been forced from this land to this land, really all in the name of colonization and this relationship that people have to land, and racism as well. So I think it was really all of those things converging together. And then there were so many interesting stories that I encountered. And I kind of feel like I'm a person who kind of knows the history of Japanese Americans but this story especially, I was like, oh, I had kind of forgotten that this is how Los Angeles gets its water, right? I'd grown up, my family's 3 generations living in Los Angeles, and we'd always hear, you have this abstract notion that we get our water from the Eastern Sierras, but like, what does that really mean, right? And so when I realized that this whole valley, almost 90% of this valley was owned by the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, I was like, oh, that's how we get our water. That is our watershed. And so I think that if I didn't understand that story, that so many other people don't also really. And given our moment in this climate crisis and our relationship and the importance of water, we face a severe drought again this year. I felt like this story had a lot of resonance.
And can I just chime in real quick with that? As someone who lived in Los Angeles and who didn't know anything about this intersection, we don't really learn about where we get our water from in Los Angeles. But on top of that, like that same land that where we got our water from was also where Japanese Americans were incarcerated, where Native Americans were forcibly removed. Like all those 3 different kind of sections of history were not being interwoven, and it felt like it was purposefully being removed from our education. You know what I mean? And it's like, that was so powerful when I first read Anne's treatment, and I was like, why don't we know these things? Like, why don't we realize that our histories are so overlapped? And there must have been some force that was trying to keep this away from us. And so, like, as someone who doesn't belong in any of those categories of people and communities, I was like, wow, just as someone who lives in Los Angeles, this really made me want to know more. And it really made me furious. And so I feel like anyone who watches this film could not, even if you're not part of this community, just as someone who lives in any metropolitan city, because this happens not just in Los Angeles, but everywhere else, like you would just get a sense of like who's writing our history books. How can we learn from each other's communities?
I didn't know any of this either until watching the film. And it was so interesting because at the end of March, I was up in Bishop for a climbing festival. And I remember we parked our cars near this fence that had the LADWP sign. And all of us were like, we're 4 hours from LA. This can't be real. And we looked it up and we were like, oh, it really is the LA Department of Water and Power. And we didn't know why. And after watching the film, now everything's clicking because Bishop is right near, right, where Manzanar is. And when I was watching it the other day, I was like, oh my God. And it really has this sense too of, you know, there's such an intentionality around making sure we don't know this, because people in cities need to just continue along. You know, water comes out of the tap when we turn the tap on, and as long as we're not thinking about where it's coming from, it's not an issue. But then that makes it so easy to exploit and to colonize and to carry out these things that if we knew about them, we wouldn't stand for them.
No, exactly. I think it's like that's exactly it. Like I would go up to Mammoth and think, oh my gosh, why is this land all open land? Why is there no development, you know, basically from Lancaster all the way up? And it's because the LA, I mean, most of it's public land anyway, but so much of it is owned by LADWP. So yeah, all of these things sort of came together and clicked when I was really doing a deep dive in the research. So
yeah, that all of that is it's so important to show how interconnected all these issues are. And I was wondering, what advice would you give to people who want to tell complex intersectional stories like yours?
Should I start?
Go ahead. Yes.
Let's see. You know, I feel like it's not easy. It takes a long time. And above and beyond, I think it's really about building real relationships with the communities that you are portraying, right? And that takes time. It takes trust. It takes real conversations and hard conversations. I think I mean, most of all, it's about really building relationships. And, you know, these communities have to trust you with their story. And so I think that's true with any documentary film, right? You know, I think that we all want to believe that, or we all believe that, you know, ethics and ethically making documentaries is really, really important. And that we're just really the conduit for telling these stories. These are their stories that we share this history with. So I think that the most important thing really is about being open and listening and really being willing to take the time to build relationships with these different communities. And I will say that it's true for all of the communities. Just because I'm Japanese American doesn't mean that I have like more in with that community. I have a different relationship. And in some ways it was perhaps because I'm an insider, it was harder, you know, because there's so much ownership of the story, right? And so even though, of course, there's acknowledgement that I'm Japanese American, you know, there's still this real trust that has to be established to tell that story. And so it is, of course, with the Native American community, given the history of, you know, I think there's other situations, other circumstances where they had relationships with other filmmakers that maybe weren't so great either. And it's also everyone, they're activists, they're really busy people. So, you know, you have to be mindful of that and be patient with, because, you know, our filmmaking schedule is not on their calendar. You know, I think they've all come around because, you know, we have really, I mean, our relationship building continues as we sort of, you know, as we do impact. And you know, we want them to use the film to tell this story that's important to all of us. And so, you know, that relationship continues to grow. But with any relationship, it has to be nurtured, and you have to listen. You know, if there are differences, you just have to listen, and you can't be afraid of conflict either.
And I also think, you know, that's like the director subject relationship, but on the other side, in like the edit room, and the way to, I mean, it's great to earn people's trust and then get all the stories, but once you collect all the stories, like, how are you going to put it together? You know, and how do you do it in a way that's rightfully reflecting every community? And so that edit process was also a very long time. And I think one thing that we did that a lot of documentary filmmakers are kind of trained not to do is we did ask for feedback from the people who we filmed, because it was more of a collaborative partnership. And we wanted to make sure also that we have their buy-in and trust even through the edit process, and not just like, oh, we're here to extract your stories and make art, and like, you're going to be happy with it and you have no choice. So I think that was also like really important for us to make sure, like throughout the entire process, that trust continued being built.
I could not have said any of that better than y'all did. It's so funny because I feel like in the last year or so, I've been in community with more women of color filmmakers, and people will say things that I'm like, did you just take that out of my brain? Did I just take that out of your brain? And it's really cool to see that there is such a collective effort to change the way that the process works, because one of the things that we talk about on our team a lot as well is how do you prioritize people over pace, and know that the only way that the relationships will get built is if you give them the time that they need. And how do you work collaboratively, right? Because like you're saying, a lot of these stories, and in the case of Expedition Reclamation, none of the stories were really the same as my story. And so it's not going to work if I'm pretending that I'm the final say on something that I might not know that much about. And so I've been thinking a lot about this idea of, you know, when people come into the industry, there's oftentimes, or there has historically been, this emphasis on like, find your voice, you know, and I think that's important. And I think as a director, especially, you are there because you are helping shape the perspective, and that's really important. But I honestly wish that I had been told first to, before I find my voice, to sit down and listen, right? To like use my ears before I start speaking. And I think that is something that this film has really taught me, because we have 12 characters. There's so many people in this film, and all of them have a different story, and none of those stories are the same as each other or the same as mine. And it speaks to how BIPOC women, that's not a monolith, right? The way that a Black woman experiences the outdoors, or an Indigenous woman experiences the outdoors, and the reasons for that are totally different from the way that I, as a settler, yes, a settler of color, but still a settler in America, experience the outdoors. And so really just allowing those stories to have breath, and like you all said, that only happens through time and through listening and through bringing those people in, and in many ways saying the traditional ways of making documentary film have been exploitative in so many ways, and so many communities, especially communities of color, still have that experience deep within them, whether it's personally or generationally. There have been so many instances where, you know, people are more hesitant to sign releases because in the past, when people have come to them with a bunch of legal lingo and asked them to sign it, they've lost their land, they've lost their houses. And so especially, you know, figuring out what that relationship is, and taking time to be like, I know I am a woman of color, but I'm still here with a camera, and that still has a power dynamic. And how do we really investigate that and shift that and make the camera a collaborative thing instead of something, a collaborative and an amplifying thing, instead of something that, like you were saying earlier, is me coming in and just extracting your story and then running with it and enjoying the social capital or the financial capital that it affords me. So I think that's I agree with everything you all said. And definitely all of that is stuff that we talk about on our team as well with Expedition.
Thank you so much for all of that amazing advice and ideas. We were wondering, how did the climate emergency influence your film's worlds, character development, or even production?
I think that, water is such a present issue for all of us right now that, this film is very ambitious in that it tells a lot of different stories. I mean, it talks about forced removal and colonization, but I do think that being able to put it into this context where we're really looking at our relationship to, from a kind of Western perspective of this resource, when really, I think Indigenous people, so many people around the world, look at water as a life force, right? And so I think to sort of step back and to be able to look at our relationship to this life source as well as to our land, I think was really important as we all face these climate issues. And so I think that that's kind of what's been unique about this film, and that it's sort of ambitiously brought all these stories together to kind of reflect on where we are. And I think that perhaps it wasn't what brought me to this story, but it's certainly, the climate crisis is certainly one of my key concerns. And I feel very comfortable in this environmental space speaking about these issues because it's something that's near and dear to me and to my family. So I think that it's in trying to tell this story it's been interesting because I think that for so many Japanese American viewers, I think also they weren't really thinking about the environment when they go to Manzanar, right? But the film is an opportunity for us to all think about water and our environment, and our relationship to land and water, coming from a different perspective. I think there are many people who are social justice advocate, activists, Native American, Indigenous peoples activists. I mean, obviously they've been so involved in this space thinking about water and climate, but all of us ultimately, I think, need to become involved and think about our future if we want a future, right? So I think and the lessons learned from this story and sort of the approach that this story I think has a lot of resonance for other communities, certainly in the West, but really across the country as well as the world, we're finding. And so I feel like all of us in this moment, our relationship to, clean water that we can drink is so fragile right now. And so it really is an opportunity to think about those things.
Yeah, and for Expedition, Anne, you were saying this word relationship a lot, and I think that's really what we were focusing on too. I think that the film is about healing those human relationships to the earth and to nature. And what that means is remembering that we are a part of nature. Nature is not something outside of us. And even though the film is about outdoor recreation, we really tried to stray away from this narrative that outdoor recreation is going out into nature, because you're in nature all the time. Like, I'm in nature sitting here right now, not just because of the plants, but just even the wall, that's nature. How can anything not be nature, right? Like, it's all made of the same stuff. And so a big part of the film was investigating, in the face of the climate crisis, it really is a spiritual crisis, right? It's a crisis of the spirit. How do we remember our roles as healers and weavers of abundance on this planet, when for so long through colonialism, we've been told we're extractors as humans? And so with the film, we really wanted to give this, we wanted to give the mic back to communities of color, because communities of color have always known how to live in reciprocity. And that's not just hiking or mountain biking or skiing or whatever it might be. It's just walking around. It's when you're eating. It's when you're with your family. It's when, whatever you are doing is in community and is in communion with the ecosystem around you. So a big part of what we were trying to do is just redefine what it means to be outdoorsy. And in the face of the climate crisis, I think that's really important because we have a really specific understanding of who an environmentalist is. And it's typically someone who maybe is a white person, maybe they're vegan, maybe they are super into like outdoor adventure, hiking, etc. And those people bring so much to the movement. That's great. But this is saying yes, and those stories are great. We've seen a lot of stories of those people, but there are so many other people who have been actively trying to heal these relationships from the dawn of time. It's not about, people of color are getting out there for the first time. It's what have they been doing forever? And how do we showcase that and make that the real cornerstone of the environmental movement? And so again, yeah, it's just about healing those relationships and kind of reclaiming who gets to lead the way as we near 7 years left to do something about this crisis. It's, I think, more essential than ever to investigate who our leaders are and who we're getting inspiration from. So I think for us with Expedition, to find these 12 everyday women and say, you are an inspiration because you recreate in reciprocity, you live in reciprocity, and you're, not necessarily some award-winning mountain biker or really well-known XYZ person. You're just a person who, because of your ancestry and because of the ways in which you are tapped into your own connection to nature, you are a leader in this space. And so, I think that one of the things that really shaped my perspective on the climate crisis is understanding that it's not an issue in itself in a silo, but rather is the lens through which we have to look at everything in our era. And when we think about it in that way, everything is or should be a climate story in some way.
It's funny, I also was going to mention that when I embarked on this project, it was part of this kind of humanities project that some colleagues who teach at some of the some of the UCs had gotten me involved in, and really one of the initial ideas was this interfaith, intercultural community space, and so that's why we were looking at the Manzanar pilgrimage. But really, this film is about this interfaith. It is a spiritual quest to think about how we are related to this place and to this land and to this water. And so I think that that's also been really, really important to this film.
100%. Yeah. Oh, Jin, were you going to say something?
No, go ahead.
I was just going to add, and to that I think that when we think about colonialism too, there's the only way that we can profit from and extract from these resources is if we separate them from ourselves. And so with water or with any kind of land, even with this idea of recreating outdoors to conquer a mountain or to bag a peak, etc., all of that discourse, it only works when we separate humans from our ecosystems. And I think that your film and Expedition and so many other stories out there are really trying to heal that gap and to say these are the same thing. And if they're the same thing, if you are the water and you are the land and vice versa, then you can't exploit it, because then you're exploiting yourself, you're extracting from yourself. And I think that being in those spaces of healing has been something that is intense in some ways because you're so hyper aware of the wound, but it's also so energizing because you're surrounded by these people that are like, yes, that's the wound. And like, here's us stepping up to reclaim our space as healers. And I think that's been something really powerful about watching your film and watching a lot of the films that have been coming out now from creators of color and these intersectional stories.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I was watching your film this morning and it was so powerful, just like seeing people in community with nature. And there is something very different, the relationship of being healers and protectors versus someone who is there to dominate, conquer, and colonize. And But for a lot of like when we were drafting our impact campaign, like one of our goals was to diversify the environmental justice industry or realm or whatever you want to call it, because a lot of young people, I think they do grow up thinking that there is no space for them if they're BIPOC, right? Like it does, the marketing for environmental justice is very white. And so for a lot of younger folks, and even like people that are not young, like I never felt that welcome and that's why I don't even like calling myself an environmentalist, because I'm like, well, I'm not vegan. I don't drive a Prius. Like I don't do all of these things. And I also like never joined like an organizational thing where they have some efforts. And then when I do go, it's like, I'm usually the only Asian person there or whatever. But yeah, when we were doing the research for this, it's like, we came across all these statistics, right? Like Native Americans are 5% of the world's population, and yet they protect 80% of the world's biodiversity. And it's like, there's ancient knowledge in all of us, right? And it's like, what are we doing to use that to heal our relationship with Earth versus like just ignoring it or not completely not seeing your part in it and then just not partaking. So I think there just needs to be a little bit of that paradigm shift, even with BIPOC communities, where even if you don't feel completely like accepted into this climate, environmental justice space, there is a place for you, and your ancestors have already shown what that looks like, and you just have to like cultivate that too.
Totally. One thing that made me think of too is when it comes to intersectional storytelling, one thing I found so powerful for myself is, what am I doing to decolonize my own mind and to re-indigenize my own mind? Because I grew up in a predominantly white town, and that's almost what led me to outdoor recreation. So in many ways, that's a privilege. But now that I am trying to find a different way to be in communion with nature and to reconnect with my own roots in nature, what am I doing to shed that colonialism and to reconnect to my own ancestry? And I think as a filmmaker that's hoping to tell stories ethically and to tell stories intersectionally, it's always important to reflect on what you're doing in your own space and how you're showing up in your own community, so that you are also taking learnings from the people that are in front of the camera, the people that are your teammates behind the camera, and bringing everything that you're talking about on screen to your life off screen as well, versus, because otherwise it does kind of become the same thing of, oh, I just told that story to like tell the story, but then are you learning from the story as a filmmaker, and are you incorporating those things in your own life, in your own journey as well? Because that is when you really honor the people who have shared themselves with you, right?
I love that so much. Thank you for that. To close out our conversation, please tell us how we can watch your films.
Oh, well, we are going to be having a PBS POV broadcast in July 18th. So tune in, tell your friends. It's a huge honor to be on this slate of POV films. It's a, really amazing list of films this year. And as every year, I mean, all the classic documentaries in the US, it seems like, are on that list. But we are also going to be doing a day of action around that. So, please be in touch. We want to do a live stream across the country of different, with different organizations that are really highlighting forest removals and environmental racism. So that will be right before the July 18th broadcast.
It will be on our website, manzanardiverted.com. We'll have everything there. Our social media will be like, hopefully very active during that time. So you can follow us on Manzanar Diverted on Instagram, where you can find more information about the Day of Action.
That's so cool. I'm gonna have to tell a lot of people. That's exciting. Yeah, for Expedition, we have a bunch of screenings happening right now as well. So there are public ones that are posted on our website, and then we're taking requests for private ones through organizations and educational systems and things like that. So that's the best way right now, as well as the festival circuit. And down the line, we are hoping to have it more widely available in libraries and online and things like that.
Thank you so much for your time and knowledge today. I've loved hearing all of the advice and ideas that you guys have given, and we'll drop the links to your websites in the chat. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank both of you as well.